From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien talks about the unexpectedly strong local wheat price basis currently in Kansas and the marketing opportunity that presents to you wheat growers. That among the topics Dan takes up during his weekly grain market segment. Then K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti is back with us, this time to talk about common problems turning up in corn and soybean stands around Kansas. Among those, gnarled corn whorls and yellow corn leaves, as well as compaction-stunted soybean plants. He'll discuss what all this means for the yield potential of those stands. And later on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp joins us. All this and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Welcome once more. For our grain market segment, the emphasis this time around will be on the wheat trade, quite appropriate as the wheat harvest in Kansas, at long last, is starting to unfurl. Joining us is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Dan, you are tracking closely now the basis levels for wheat at our local elevators, which, of course, would be important market information for producers as they make their decisions on storing or selling that wheat.
Yes, and when we come into the start of the harvest periods in any of these wheat years, I think that we're at risk if the crop comes on strong and world conditions are such where there's no great shortfall in supplies. We're at risk, basically, to see wheat basis levels widen. And really, so far, we've hung in very, very well, surprisingly well, for wheat basis levels. When you look at representative locations in, we call the western two-thirds of the state, Colby, Garden City, Salina, and Hutchinson, we've been, since the first of the year, rolling along with as high a basis levels as we've seen since 2016. Now, last year when we came to this time period, it was apparent we had production problems, and the basis jumped higher, especially in the central third of the state and southwest as well. But even with that, we haven't seen any drop-off in what we've got going this year. In fact, so far we're moving steadily along sideways, and with the reports of potential for high yields that we have, that's an impressive finding in my view. When you look at the eastern two-thirds of the state, kind of classifying Clay Center as Columbus as the representative places we're looking at. Amazing the amount of strength you've seen in wheat basis down in the southeast corner of the state at Columbus, running at near par a couple months ago, and has softened some since then, but still the strongest hard red winter wheat basis we've seen in that area since the beginning of calendar year 2016. For the Clay Center area, had been about 25 under, down to about 40, 42, 45, something like that now, but still strong relative to where we've been. So it bodes well for what the market expects to see happen in terms of demand. We do have some export numbers that have come out, and it's noteworthy, I think, that the USDA in their June 11th report came out and projected U.S. wheat exports at 900 million bushels for this marketing year. That'd be down from that June 11th projection of 950 for the old crop marketing year. So projecting not, quote, falling out of bed for wheat exports, but a decent number. And on Monday's inspection report, we were at about 15.8 million bushels of U.S. wheat inspected for export. So not too bad of numbers, really. In my own mind, if we can come through having a good hard red winter wheat crop yield-wise and maintain quality protein specifications for that would be just a tremendous thing. So we do hear of expectations, different folks in the trade wondering about what type of spring wheat acres that they'll have. So maybe part of this issue of support that we're seeing is having to do with some challenges in getting the spring wheat acreage planted up in the states to the north of us, and also some challenges they've had with lower acreage up into Canada. So in the balance of all of that in North America, we're a little weaker than we had thought we would be up in the hard red spring states, some excessive moisture problems in the soft red area in the eastern corn belt. So maybe that gives us some cover with the higher yields we think we see coming here in the Great Plains and the hard red winter wheat areas.
And should producers be taking full advantage of that cover right now? It's back to that perennial question of whether to let that wheat go as it crosses the elevator scales or to store it away for a better day.
That is a question to ponder, Eric. And I make fun of it only because it's so difficult to answer. When you look what's happened in the last several weeks in terms of at least July wheat futures, and again, we'll be seeing the beginning of deliveries on July wheat futures at the end of this month. Well, in fact, basically, as we're talking, it's begun. And when we roll over to the next contract, will that affect basis some? Sometimes it does, particularly if the market maintains a carry from July to September. And if the market sees fit to take cash prices sideways, then you end up and widen out the basis a little bit. So we'll see. And right now the carry between the July and the September contract is, it's about 6 cents or so. So with that, we'll see how that affects basis. But had been as low as about early part of March, as about 380, 385, jumped up as high as about $4.90, almost to $5. By the time we got to midweek of this week, we were about $4.69, $4.70, something like that. So we're certainly about 80, 90 cents higher than the lows we'd seen not that long ago, but we're down about 30, 40 from the highs that we had seen in late May. So if we have the combination of decent wheat futures and maintenance of pretty good basis levels, it's hard to not want to take advantage of wheat sales for a combination like that, given that we just don't know what the future holds. If there's anything that I would wonder about on the wheat market, it would be that short U.S. corn production could pull wheat feeding demand, and particularly out in this part of the world where we're at. So if we do have some lower protein wheat in some of these areas, it could be an opportune year to sell into feed demand as the U.S. corn market finds itself in short supply. We shall see.
Well, later on this morning, the USDA will post the much-anticipated numbers on corn and other row crop acreage, as well as its latest quarterly grain stocks report. And, of course, the market observers have come forth with all sorts of predictions on what those numbers might say. What are you looking for amidst all that, Dan?
Well, looking at corn, cotton, and sorghum in our part of the world, and, of course, soybeans are important as well. When you look at the corn number, the USDA came out in the June 11th WASDE report and projected about 89.8 million acres planted. The pre-report trade guess is for about 86.67, thereabouts, so down about 3 million acres. You're getting to the place where that 86, 87 is about 5 million acres less than what we had seen in the initial, March 29th forecast for prospective plantings. So we've seen at least that much lower. You do have the low side estimate of about 82 million acres, which is down 10. This is still a floating number in terms of what we finally end up with. So this is a survey taken of conditions and expectations basically as of the 1st of June, and we were still in flux when that was happening. You do have an expectation of soybean acres about unchanged from earlier projections. So what has not happened, probably because of excess wetness, is that we haven't seen the major shift from corn over into soybeans, which, taken in balance, probably means that cotton and sorghum have come up some, and the rest has probably prevented planting. Cotton acres projected to be by the trade about 13.8 million acres, had been in the March prospective planting numbers just a little bit lower than that. Grain sorghum had been projected about 5.135 million acres. Trade's guessing about 5.29, about 5.3 thereabouts. I wouldn't be surprised if it's that or 100,000 or 200,000 acres more than that. We just have enough factors that have pushed people off into other crops that it'd be really interesting to see how cotton and sorghum and really barley, oats, and everything else, how all these other crops work themselves out, as farmers have done what they could, but haven't always been able to do much in the face of the flooded, wet fields they have.
And on the grain stock side, anything likely out of those numbers that might stimulate the markets?
I think for grain stocks, really the big number, I think, is corn feeding and possibly wheat feeding. I don't know that we've seen the wheat feeding begin yet, if that is going to happen, but for corn, the key number is the pre-trade estimate for June 1 corn stocks of about 5.35 billion bushels. And if that number is markedly lower than that pre-trade guess, that would be indicative of more livestock feeding than we'd anticipated, and that'd be a real positive for the market. I guess we'll just have to wait and see how that works itself out. But we're in the mode where, with lower supplies for that key feed grain, we're going to see some secondary effects on these other crops, both in terms of acres and in terms of usage. And it'll be the issue that we wrestle with market-wise all the way through the rest of the summer, I think.
All right, those numbers once more out of the USDA within the hour. And when we talk again next Friday, Dan, we'll recap those numbers and talk about how the markets reacted to them. Appreciate your time, as always.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien is with us each week on Agriculture Today to get into the grain market trends. He is K-State Research and Extension grain market economist. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Next up after the break, a closer look at what we'll call the irregularities being seen so far in Kansas corn and soybean plantings, and what's at the root of those, literally as well as figuratively. Please keep it right here on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today is back now here on the K-State Radio Network. As promised, we have another conversation with crop production and cropping systems specialist Ignacio Ciampitti of K-State Research and Extension. Yesterday, he talked with us about late planting of grain sorghum and soybeans and some adjustments you producers might want to make in either of those cases. But Ignacio, let's now troubleshoot the crops that were planted earlier, squeezed in between the rains that have plagued this planting season in Kansas, and we have a whole slew of stand problems out there, you tell us. Let's start with corn. What are you seeing and hearing about?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, as always, for the invitation.
You bet.
Do we have an hour?
No.
Okay.
So you can give the abridged version.
I will give you very unfortunately, I will give you the abridged version. So, corn. I think that we are seeing a couple of things. For those guys that they plant too early into wet conditions, we are seeing lack of uniformity in some fields. Plants that they have kind of a different size, so you might see plants that they are B5 with 5 leaves, and then some ones that they are behind, so clearly it's telling us those plants came 10, 15 days after. Lack of uniformity. And then one interesting fact that we are just releasing that today in our e-update, issues of twisted whorls, and then we have seen basically some leaves that they were trapped and based on the low temperature conditions, okay? And then those leaves that they were basically developing inside of the whorl, they were not exposed, so they never really produced that photosynthesis and then the chlorophyll, And then when they come out quickly, almost the full size, they come out totally yellow. Because it's a first reaction of, lack of being exposed to light.
So these are physiological issues that could amount to something pretty serious as far as
and exactly.
productivity.
And also, if you don't diagnose this very well, you might think that this is a nitrogen deficiency.
No.
And then farmers can take a wrong conclusion based on just by looking at the field and thinking, okay, I have a section of the field that is under deficiency. This year, most likely, this could be a possibility, correct? We went through multiple rounds of rains, and then many of the farmers are wondering, okay, if the nitrogen is still there or not. This specific problem that we are seeing on these leaves that they were trapped, and now they were basically coming out from the whorl, we are seeing that they are yellow. So that is just basically a simple issue connected to low temperature. And then these leaves they are coming out. They are basically exposed to the light for the first time, and it's nothing connected to a deficiency. It's important to mention this because we have seen already multiple fields in multiple locations that they might think that there is a deficiency, but basically we call this as a sun starvation, so lack of exposed to sun. And it's just those leaves, they will they will adapt, they will acclimate, and then basically they will develop that chlorophyll, and they will start going back to normal.
So that problem quite likely will correct itself.
Yeah, and most of the times, we are seeing that, I think that was 2 years ago, and these conditions are very, very similar in terms of having below normal temperatures. And then some of the leaves are basically still expanding inside of the whorl, and then what they're coming out, they're coming almost on the full size, but they were never exposed to light.
Okay.
And one of the things, on the article we have more details, and we say to make sure to inspect the fields. Usually these conditions tend to appear when the corn is around B4 and B8, so in between 4 leaves and 8 leaves. So some of the corn that got planted mid-May or the end of May is probably going into some of these conditions right now. And then if the conditions improve, in terms of temperature, we will start seeing that these kind of yellow tops, they will start fading away. Based on our study, we are not seeing any yield effects. Not at this time and not with this situation. So now moving to the most pessimistic part of this section for corn, depending on what sections of the state, with hail. So my 2 cents from the corn side. Always think about the growing point. If we are after B5, 5 leaves, the growing point is above the ground. So whatever was affecting that growing point, most likely those plants will have less chances to recover. And then if we are before B5, so if we are with 4 or 3 leaves or 2 leaves, those plants, the growing point is underground, so those plants might have more possibilities to recover. Of course, one of my 2 cents always when we are looking at hail damage is go after a week or 10 days. Don't go the first day immediately because
it doesn't look good.
It doesn't look
first blush.
I did a couple, and then it doesn't look good. And I would say go at least a week or 10 days after, and then the evaluation will be, is a new leaf coming or not? Some of the things that we're also seeing is that you might start seeing some tillers. Why? Because this is not a really common phenomenon in corn. I'm looking at tillers, but the plant is basically sometimes losing that growing point, or not exactly losing the growing point, but losing the apical dominance. So rather than just to shoot one stem, you will start seeing basically maybe 3. So there are different hypotheses. If you are in a very low plant density, we will see if sometimes those tillers, they don't become as productive. So we are doing some studies this year of even looking at seeing how productive are the tillers. So we have one student, if you see them around, so running in Garden City and Colby and Goodland, and then trying to start assessing basically what is the final contribution of tillers into yield, because I think that is, for many of our farmers, it's an extremely relevant question. So that's on the corn side.
What about soybeans? And while we're on the subject of hail, the damage inflicted there?
Yeah. On soybeans, one of the things is similar. It's basically, I haven't seen much of a soybean hail out. We are seeing more of the corn. The soybean, we have the opportunity that many of these, if the growing point is still under the ground, so still those plants can recover. Basically, those soybeans can just compensate much better, in terms of corn. Soybeans can always increase branching and add more branches and then just compensate for that lack of really main stem. We were too early in the growing season for soybeans, so those plants can recover. They were in many stands too early, so we are not seeing too much effect. What we are seeing on soybeans, on the ones that were planting, I would say 4 weeks before today, more or less, lack of plants in some sections of the field.
Due to flooding, oversaturation, or something else?
All of above. Most of the times it's connected to compaction. We are seeing problems of crusting. I think that in some places we pushed too hard. We went into kind of a little bit more close to saturated soils, and then we are seeing seeds on the ground in some places. They were not closing very well the seed row, lack of acid soil contact, so we are seeing some plants that with not much. When you start digging a little bit on some places in the rows, you are seeing that the roots are just barely kind of expanding, which basically is telling you that connected to the compaction, connected to the saturated soil. So when you have waters that is saturated in the first layer of the soil, those roots are growing without oxygen. They are not expanding. So, and if you have this situation for a couple of days, not only you might probably finish with disease and lack of anchorage and poor nutrient uptake, but also you finish with some really poor root development. And then to recover many times, and you can see that situation of some of the plants that were trying to expand horizontally more than vertically. So we are seeing a mix of combinations of saturated soils and compacted soils, many of those coming from really poor planting conditions.
And of course the question then becomes, will those afflicted plants have any chance of recovering to the point of being decently productive?
And it's an excellent question. In many situations what we are doing is scouting those fields, looking at root size, trying to really go deep and trying to go to a dry area of the field, looking at the roots on those sections and trying to go back to saturated areas of the field and looking at the roots on those sections, so we have a point of comparison. In some places we know that we are already set for really poor productivity, and we hope that we can get some yield. And we are already seeing that in many fields. Some fields that are already those compacted low areas of the field, they will be producing, but really not much. Those plants, you already have seen even from today that those plants are already behind, and sometimes they are behind in development. Some plants were, the ones that I was expecting this week, they were unifoliates, and in the best area of the field were already with 2 trifoliates. So already showing difference in development and showing difference in size. Multiple factors of conditions, so we need to start scouting, looking at those poor sections of the field to start looking and considering multiple options and taking decisions there.
Well, you are, Ignacio, putting the finishing touches on articles on all of this and more. And as far as the ills afflicting our corn and soybeans, which were planted here the last few weeks, that's going to be out later today in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series. Look for that at agronomy.ksu.edu. Click on the E-Update link toward the upper right-hand side of that page and take in that information and see how it applies to your cropping situation, producers. Ignacio, thanks for the observations, as always.
Thanks, Eric, for the invitation.
Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension there. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network. We'll return with more after this break here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and continuing on now with today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue says that the USDA has decided that it can make a minimal payment to farmers under the Market Facilitation Program 2 for cover crops that are planted on prevented planting acres. However, he did not signal how much the payment would amount to and noted that the agency is close to announcing the details of the MFP2 effort. Quoting the Secretary, the reason we're close is the prevented planting triggers are done. He said further, that was our purpose for being intentionally opaque about the plans and not having producers trying to farm the program. I think we are close to beginning disclosing some of these plans, in Perdue's words. He said USDA will also top off prevented planting payments using money from the recently approved disaster aid package, but said that the amount of increased payments will depend on how many prevented planting acres there are. While many are touting the potential for farmer payments under MFP2, crop insurance, the disaster package, and being able to sell forage harvested from cover crops on prevented plant acres, said Perdue, all combined will not come up to what a farmer could have earned if they could have planted. In his words, prevented planting is not a strategy, it's a fallback safety mechanism. On a related note, the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service reminds you that it's offering a special environmental quality incentives program sign-up for producers in governor-declared counties in Kansas who could not plant crops because of flooded or wet fields. This sign-up provides technical and financial assistance to help producers plant cover crops. The deadline to apply for that is July the 26th. To apply for this special EQIP funding, contact, of course, your local NRCS office. Producers with prevented planting coverage through the crop insurance program can hay, graze, or chop a cover crop. The Risk Management Agency adjusted the final haying and grazing date from November the 1st back to September the 1st to help producers who were prevented from planting or delayed in planting due to the flooding and rainfall. For more information on those options, again, contact your local USDA Service Center. Changes have been made in the USDA's dairy margin coverage program. The USDA's Stephanie Ho tells us what those are.
USDA Undersecretary Bill Northey points to some of the changes in the new dairy margin coverage program, which is based on the old margin protection program.
This decreased the premium. This added to the amount of margin that was available. The previous program had an $8 margin availability. This one has a $9.50 availability.
He says there also is more flexibility for bigger producers who can insure the first up to 5 million pounds of their production.
They had a disincentive to participate in the last round. All producers have a good incentive to participate in this round.
The sign-up period is open now and ends on September 20th.
We have about 5,300 producers that have certified their production in the Dairy Margin Coverage Program. I believe last year, our Margin Protection Program, we had about over 21,000 producers that participated.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And the Environmental Protection Agency is expected to propose the new annual renewable fuel blending targets via the Renewable Fuel Standard for 2020 ahead of the July 4th recess, according to contacts for DTN. Renewable fuel groups are hoping and lobbying to see a sizable boost in the amount of ethanol refiners are expected to blend to make up for the previous refinery exemptions and waivers from the EPA. Well, an intensive research effort continues right here in Manhattan to improve new wheat varieties by turning to the past. Marcia Boswell provides an update on this work on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The Wheat Genetics Resource Center is a secret gem in the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. The Wheat Genetics Resource Center is an international wheat gene bank that stores over 700,000 seeds and 14,000 accessions. The WGRC has a climate-controlled storage environment for these seeds and greenhouse space to help plants germinate and flourish in order for research to be conducted. While a lot of their research is done in the building, another important aspect to the WGRC is their field plots. Recently, at the Rocky Ford Field Day, the WGRC scientists showed people the hard work they have accomplished over the past year of research. People who attended this event had the chance to see all of the wild wheat species that the WGRC research team is growing on these plots. The WGRC grew wild wheat relatives on these plots to look for the characteristics that may be valuable to Kansas wheat growers and could potentially be bred into our modern varieties in the future. One trait researchers are specifically looking for is rust resistance in these wild wheats. When scientists plant these wild wheats, they are curious to see how they adjust in the actual climate of Kansas that they cannot control. Some of these wild wheats are flourishing in the Kansas environment this year, while others are on the slow-growing side with the rain that Manhattan has received. Even when the varieties fail to thrive in Kansas, that data is extremely valuable to the WGRC team. According to John Robb, senior scientist at the WGRC, the research we do here is important because we've discovered the ancestors of wheat and can continuously learn characteristics of the new wild wheats that we grow. Knowing the different types of wheat and their purposes can be a tricky concept to grasp, but the scientists here at WGRC are dedicated to learning all the ins and outs about these trait-rich wild wheats. The characteristics of these wheats that are grown at Rocky Ford can have microscopic differences, but these differences can be crucial. All of the wild wheat that is grown in the test plots are grown with a purpose. These scientists utilize all of the information that they gather with growing these wheats. Ropp says every species has different characteristics, and sometimes it's tricky to find those characteristics. Some species you know before it's fully grown, and others we have to do more research to discover the species. The research done at the WGRC is important for everybody in the wheat industry. Other scientists use the results that they find at the WGRC to better the production of wheat both in Kansas and around the globe. The scientists in the WGRC are very active in the research that they do. They are very passionate about the collection they have curated over decades of research. The work done at the WGRC will continue to grow, and they'll discover new things about wheat. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. Remember, if you're interested in listening to Agriculture Today on demand, take advantage of our podcast service. It's quite easy to subscribe for those direct downloads to your mobile device. Go to this address, agtoday.net, agtoday.net. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly looking at the Kansas agricultural weather scene. And along with us via phone this week is research and extension climatologist Mary Knapp. She's actually in California, Mary, you say, where you're attending a meeting with your peers?
Right. It is the annual meeting of the American Association of State Climatologists, and we get together once a year and look at all of the projects that people are doing and what's happening in their region and various things of that nature.
Sounds like a fruitful meeting. And back here in Kansas, summer is on, officially and climatologically, that's for sure. We've had a fair amount of heat these past few days. Right.
It's been, again, like you said, climatologically, we would expect it at this time of the year, but it may surprise people to note that we actually ended the week cooler than normal across the state, and that was ending on Tuesday. But we need to keep in mind that our normal highs as we get into July will be in the 90 to 92, 93 degree range. We are warmer than normal today, or expected to be, and indeed next 8 to 14 days are expected to be warmer than normal, but it's likely to be on the low temperature side rather than the high temperature. And of course, the issue with that is the heat index values are going to be extremely uncomfortable and, in fact, reaching the danger range. And they do have a heat advisory out for the northeastern quadrant of the state.
Mm-hmm. As you bring that up, we might mention this. Livestock comfort will be a potential issue as particularly those nighttime temperatures stay rather lofty. So you and your colleagues that manage the Mesonet website here at K-State came up with what's called the Cattle Comfort Index that could be very resourceful for our livestock producers in conditions like these.
Right, and it's actually the Animal Comfort Index because it is applicable. It's based on cattle, but it is applicable to other confined animal operations. And you can go to that under the agricultural link on our Mesonet page, and it does show right now we have moved into the mild stress for the eastern, basically third of the state. That's as of this minute, and those values are likely to continue to move into the more dangerous range as we get into the warmer parts of the day. In the west, where the humidity levels are lower, we're not seeing nearly that potential for stress. But central and eastern parts of the state, you're going to be wanting to watch that very carefully. Mm-hmm.
This tool provides a running account of conditions, and producers can utilize that to assess just how much stress their stock might be in any given moment.
Right, and for how long they might be in there. They do have a chart option on that, so you can look at it over time and see what that might be like. Not that it's very pertinent now, but it's also something that you can look at in the wintertime because it does have that cold stress on the other side of the range. But of course, right now, cold stress is not an issue, but that's something to remember as we get back into the winter season.
You'll find that index again at mesonet.ksu.edu, mesonet.ksu.edu. The upside of the hotter temperatures, the growing degree units are starting to accumulate in favor of the planted row crops, and it'll help usher along winter wheat harvest likewise.
Right. It's been very noteworthy just how quick some of the late planted corn and soybeans have managed to start developing, adding the canopy, and beginning to look fairly good. The positive side is that most of the corn is not yet in the flowering stage, so a little bit of heat at this time is not as likely to be damaging as if we were in full tassel or pollen setting stage. So hopefully we'll get through that period, and the outlook for the 8 to 14 time period does continue to look for a warmer than normal pattern. Doesn't necessarily mean highs in the 100-degree range. Again, it's likely to be on the lower end because the humidity levels are simply not going to drop very quickly given how much soil moisture and water is available to evaporate and continue to add to the atmospheric moisture.
And this past week has featured more rainfall in several parts of Kansas. But as we look forward, will we see dry weather set in for a time anyway?
Well, it looks like the next week is going to be on the dry side. The quantitative precip forecast for the week ending the 5th of July actually has 0 precipitation out in the southwest and central part of the state. In northeast, it may be more in the 1/4 to 1/2 inch range. There may be a pocket or two of 3/4 of an inch, but given the rainfall that we've seen in the last week, that's pretty close to dry for that as well. But as you move out to that 8 to 14-day period, it looks like the rains are likely to return. The Climate Prediction Center's outlook for that time period continues to favor wetter than normal conditions. So we'll watch it, but it doesn't look like we're going to face an abrupt shift to no rain. That is unlikely at this point.
And the remainder of the summer, as the extended outlook goes, as you've shared before, is calling for still wetter than normal conditions as well, right?
Right. The outlook for July, August, and September favors wetter than normal across the Central Plains, basically from northern Texas up to the border of North and South Dakota, westward into Idaho, and eastward into Missouri. So a very large area of the center of the country favors that wetter. On the temperature side, the outlook actually favors cooler than normal across the Central Plains. Again, not surprising given the amount of moisture that is there. A lot of the energy is going into evaporation and not so much into heating up the air temperatures.
All right. Many thanks for the summary, Mary, and good travels back to Kansas.
Thanks, Eric. I'm looking forward to getting back.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And that's our time for today and the week. Thanks for being along with us once again. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.